If you don't know me, my name is Megan Mason. I made this video for two reasons. I wanted to share a PowerPoint that I created to raise awareness about the global crisis in family courts. This is something that some people close to me know of on a personal basis, but I don't think people understand that it's a widespread social justice issue in the US and, in fact, around the world. So I created this to educate people about what's happening. And the second problem is the crisis that I'm facing, and I discussed this in the presentation, can only happen because the community is complacent and allows it to happen. Our family courts have been corrupted, and it's part of a broader picture where our institutions are in threat. As it is today, I am a woman who's never committed a crime, was never accused of a crime. I've never abused my children. I was never accused of abusing my children. And yet, my ex husband, who's a financial criminal, was able to bribe a guardian ad litem who has power in the Cook County machine in order to destroy me financially, which has cost me my career. I'm now homeless and cost me my standing in the community. I'm treated like a pariah, and many people think I'm mentally unwell, although they aren't lining up to help me. And uh, obviously, that's not a great thing to experience, but I'm more interested in the social factors that lead to these things. So I created this video because I want people to start standing up for domestic violence victims who are being destroyed by family courts around the world. I want people to share this and raise awareness, and I want this to stop. And here's the other weird piece. My situation is unique. This presentation is about corruption with a little c, which is still very bad. And what I mean by that is that because of longstanding practices, vested interests, financial interests, a whole industry called the parental alienation industry, the court system that determines parentage decisions in divorce cases, especially, is geared towards awarding custody to child abusers and punishing those who report. And this happened to me. But this was only part of what happened to me. I also experienced corruption with a capital C. My ex husband is named Peter Matt. He has engaged extensively in tax evasion and money laundering. Money laundering is a predicate act in racketeering. Uh, in 2021, I discovered that a prior attorney had committed fraud and various other people had committed well documented, obvious fraud. I shared this in a number of places. Most people are inclined to not believe me, but it's all there, whether you want to look on my website linked below or Instagram, where I've shared extensively. And I'm very confident because the Department of Justice has me in witness protection while they build this racketeering case. And I don't think they would be doing that if the crimes that I have said happened didn't happen. But I really don't want to talk about the big C corruption here. I want to talk about the circumstances that allowed for the extreme corruption in Chicago, because, we kind of do corruption a little better. I want to explain how globally that happened. So, if you know me, if I've ever inspired any goodwill in you, please watch this video. Please read my presentation and please share it with three people. And please stand up for victims like me.
Riyam al-Salam is the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls. In June of this year, she produced a report which shockingly documented the ways in which around the world children are routinely ordered into the custody of abusive parents. Although this impacts all kinds of domestic violence victims, it is especially prevalent in cases where child sex abuse has been alleged. She identified the industry, which has come to be known as the parental alienation industry, as the driving force behind this trend. The concept of parental alienation was developed by a debunked theorist and apologist for child sex abuse named Richard Gardner. Gardner, in the late 60s and becoming prominent into the 80s, especially, proposed an idea that where a child has alleged that a parent has abused him or her, the child must have done so because he or she was coached by a hysterical or vindictive or insane protective parent, usually a mother. What's notable about parental alienation theory, if you can call it that, it's been discredited by literally every medical organization and the United Nations, the Department of Justice, every organization except the attorneys who profit from it and the judges who allow it to happen. The theory it relies on the fact that there is no proof that the child has been coached. There's no other signs of abuse. In cases of domestic violence, it is in fact very normal for a parent to turn a parent against another. That's a way to undermine the other parent and inflict coercive control. But in parental alienation theory, there's usually no evidence that the parent has coached the child. The evidence is that the child has reported child abuse, whether to a doctor, a reviewing therapist, or another party. When I say that Gardner was a proponent of child sex abuse, I mean that quite literally. He argued that in many cases, children initiate their own sexual abuse, and evidence can be found that they enjoy it and that it is something that benefits them. In fact, in his book, Child Custody Litigation, Gardner even suggested that mothers in particular, who are usually the reporters of child sex abuse, of course it happens to all types of children, all types of parents, that these mothers should be educated to understand that child sex abuse has been normal throughout human history and that they're being hysterical. It's truly shocking that Gardner's theories are still being used in courts today and in fact are growing in magnitude according to Al-Salam's report. But in order to understand how this can happen, you first have to understand that child abuse, particularly child sex abuse, is taboo, so uncomfortable that it in fact makes it difficult for those in the community who might stop it or report it or take actions to protect those children. It makes people want to avoid the topic at all. In January of 2020, I heard a podcast on the Daily where a New York Times investigative reporter had been investigating images of child sex abuse proliferated online through platforms like Facebook. What they had found was that despite grandiose promises from Congress in the years before, child sex abuse is so prevalent and imagery so prevalent online that the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, when investigating reports where, to put it bluntly, someone has received images of children being sexually abused online, that they only had enough resources to investigate reports of infants and toddlers. They didn't have enough resources to investigate preschool and school-aged children. This isn't something that I would have believed could happen in this country, but it's in fact people's aversion and fear of the topic of child sex abuse that protects the abusers. When I was in college in the late 90s, I read a book called Satan's Silence, which documented child sex abuse hysteria in the 1980s. At this time, there was a wave across the country and many high-profile cases where there was sort of a frenzy to identify occult practices, accusing daycare owners, teen boys, various people of being satanic, or in cases where children were harmed, latching on to the kid who played Dungeons and Dragons or dressed like a goth. And as was documented in the book, many times the people targeted were innocent. And the hysteria about Satanism truly detracted from the core issue, which is the safety of children. But the problem with the satanic panic was that while there was a lot of coverage of the false allegations, what was lost is the fact that many children are abused in childcare settings, and pedophiles do conspire. They just don't happen to usually do it with pentagrams. Because of this fear of the topic of child sex abuse and because of this focus on the false cases, today, as in the 80s, children who are genuinely being tortured in their families are ignored, while other more salacious issues take hold. Unequal access to justice has always been a core feminist issue, And much like reproductive rights, it was something that I think today's women took for granted as having been obtained and something that they could count on. But as it stands today, women are subjugated to a separate justice system. 93% of criminal convicts are men. So I think it's quite fair to say that criminal courts are a male domain. By contrast, the area of law where I have been subjected to abuse is called the Domestic Relations Division, which is quite interesting. Much like the domestic sphere is considered the role of women, that's where the abuse of women happens today. Elizabeth Packard was a pioneering feminist and, like me, an Illinois mother. She was institutionalized by her abusive husband, who was actually a financial criminal, it turns out, as well. He was upset because she disagreed with him about religion, and so he had her institutionalized. And Elizabeth Packard, though she was writing in the 1860s, thought of herself as an American. She thought of herself as protected by the Constitution, even though, of course, there was a separate set of laws and restrictions on the extent to which women could appear in court. There was still this belief that we lived in a free country ruled by law. So it was truly shocking to her that her husband could do this. And what was more shocking was that nobody cared. I found Packard's book early in my experience of corruption. It was one of the first times I could relate to somebody and found somebody who understood my circumstance. Not the abuse so much, but the fact that she thought for sure somebody would help her because it was so wrong, and nobody did. Another similarity between Elizabeth Packard's issue with the courts that institutionalized her and today's family courts is that, without exception, when women are accused of parental alienation, she is going to be accused of being mentally unfit. That's sort of at the heart of it, that there must be some sort of truly toxic, devious mental condition. After all, how else could you justify separating the woman from her children? The feedback that I get quite often from people who are looking into my case and articles, videos, other documents that I've shared is that there's so many things going on. They don't understand what the issue is because I've reported about a Guardian Ad Litem named David Pasulka, who used to rape women in Chicago by threatening to take their children away if they didn't have sex with him. And he did not lose his job as a Guardian Ad Litem until he was indicted. I've also talked about Raul Vega, who was a judge who was known to be so abusive towards women in his court that I was ordered to show cleavage and wear miniskirts when I appeared before him. And he openly flirted and winked at women from the bench. 28 female attorneys wrote to presiding Judge Grace Dickler in 2020 about abuse that was so rampant that women working in the court were subject to sexual harassment, including rape. Judge Dickler did nothing to intervene, and in fact, she promoted Judge Raul Vega to a leadership position to remove him from litigants like me and to hide his abuse. Dickler and Vega both left in disgrace in recent years. I made this diagram to show how these seemingly unrelated issues, scandals, are in fact quite tied. The reason I'm reaching out to you, the reason I want you to reach out to everyone you know, is because at the bottom of this pyramid is public indifference. People either don't know or don't care about what's happening. And I know most people are good. They wouldn't say, oh, I think it's okay for a child to be abused and then ordered to live with the person abusing them. But people either find it easier not to believe that it happens or not to think about it because perhaps they feel like they can't do anything. The problem is that this indifference allows the abusers to thrive. And then you can build on top of that experts and vested interests who are able to expand their control of the courts because the community has abdicated their responsibility to oversee the courts. But increasingly, family court proceedings are held in private. And almost always, when there's a case of abuse, there's a special focus on privacy for the sake of the parties, ostensibly. But secrecy only helps abusers. Once the reviewing courts, civil rights advocates, civil rights attorneys, the press, faith leaders, politicians, and other important leaders who normally hold institutions in check abdicate their responsibility to women like me and our children, then a court can truly be corrupted. And that's when the bad actors move in. And that's what's happened in Chicago. To illustrate this point, as I record this, a man named Ed Burke is on trial. He's an alderman who's in trial for good old corruption in Chicago. When Ed Burke was indicted and left his office, a man who had worked for him for 10 years as an attorney for the city of Chicago had to find a new job. He didn't get indicted, but his gig was shut down. So his name is Matthew Link, and he elected to be nominated as a domestic relations judge, because the domestic relations division is where there's money to be made and power to be doled out. If you're like me, you probably assume that I have access to the right of appeal, or you might assume that there's a possibility that I could have my judge substituted. I cannot. This is both through direct actions taken by the trial judge and by the Cook County Machine's focus on protecting its own at all costs. Most notably, almost all of the most damaging rulings issued by Robert Johnson, a judge assigned post-decree, were issued without me being engaged in litigation before him. I know that sounds kind of strange, but basically, a case has never started, so a case will never end. I was divorced on September 25th, 2017. And since that time, Judge Johnson has issued numerous extrajudicial orders, just orders that were not based in law or fact. Most notably, he issued a 2-year plenary order of protection in a handwritten order. There was no motion for a plenary order of protection, and therefore there couldn't have been a trial, and there wasn't. And yet I was barred for 2 years from any contact with my children. This was an illegal order, so in theory, I should be able to get it overturned. But Domestic Relations Division alum Sharon Oden Johnson sits on the Illinois' first appellate court, and she plays whack-a-mole with women like me. I've tried to access my right of appeal 3 times, and she doesn't issue a ruling because that would create a paper trail, but she does issue a note denying me the right to access appeal. Her basis is that my appeal is interlocutory, and I need to wait until my case is closed. But my case has never started, so it can never close. This sounds dystopian and horrible, and it is. Because it's dystopian and horrible, I would have thought that the American Civil Liberties Union would want to become involved. I cannot explain why they don't acknowledge civil rights abuses in family courts, despite their grotesque and shocking nature. But my hunch is that quite simply, lawyers culturally look out for their own. And there is a bias to want to believe that women like me are crazy, confused, or lying. The refusal of the American Civil Liberties Union, in particular, to acknowledge the civil rights crisis in our family courts is doubly damaging, not only because they don't provide free legal support to people like me, but the fact that they don't provide the support delegitimizes my complaints, which absolutely would be taken seriously if they occurred in a criminal court. Much like the vacuum of reviewing courts allows for corrupt actors to move into the court itself, the absence of the Fourth Estate's duty to review the courts, the absence of the legitimate press, the absence of civil rights groups, creates space for far-right fringe groups. Most notably, QAnon is often closely aligned with hashtag Save Our Children. Earlier this summer, I came across the story of a woman named Catherine Kasanoff. Catherine Kasanoff struck me, first of all, because like me, she was a highly educated, successful, professional woman. It's not fair, but if somebody has a drug addiction or has a criminal record, then the court quite simply has more liberty, right or wrong, often wrong if it's a family court, to say that she's demonstrated unfitness. But Catherine Kasanoff had an impeccable record. She just happened to be a domestic violence victim, and her children were as well. And like me, she reported her husband's abusive behaviors and was punished for that. Catherine Kasanoff killed herself. She had a terminal illness, but she wanted to kill herself to raise awareness of the issue. And it was through her story that I learned about other children and families The children mostly post on TikTok. Often they're reunification camp survivors. They tell their stories of sexual and physical abuse that they've experienced. And they share videos of being hauled off by paid security guards who've been ordered by the court to take them to reunification camps. And mothers like me and the relatives of mothers like me who've passed also share our stories. Like me, most of the mothers, protective parents, and I also know protective parents who are fathers. There are certainly abusive mothers who have employed family courts if they have money. Most of the mothers are on Instagram, and two mothers in particular whose stories I'm familiar with and believe have suffered even longer than I have. Justice for Hazel reported very credible sexual abuse of her daughter, I believe 7 years ago. And for 7 years, she's had to know that her daughter is ordered to live with her rapist. Ginger Flower has been separated from her daughters for 3 years, and she also reported sexual abuse, and her daughters were ordered with their rapist. As a rule, we're always barred from contact with our children. But there are also new experts speaking out. To be honest, the kind of abuse that I experienced is something that I'm still understanding. And it's been with the help of women like Dr. Emma Katz and Christina Cocciola, who is also a therapist who specialize in coercive control and have a great understanding of the family court's role in this system. The use of the family courts is intentional and strategic by the type of man that I married, that type of domestic abuser. They seek out institutions where they can inflict pain and punishment and control the partner who's dared to leave them. And with the family courts corrupted, if they have enough money, that is absolutely something they can do in America today. As I said at the top of this presentation, there's corruption and then there's corruption. And I've experienced both, and my boys and I are currently being victimized by both. I find myself in a strange position because, unlike so many of the other moms, and in addition to Justice for Hazel and Ginger Flower, there are countless women who comment and add their story and share that the exact same thing is happening to them all across this country. And there are growing contributors on social media sharing stories that are eerily similar to theirs and mine. But because my abuser happened to commit some very stupid financial crimes, and I was a financial advisor, so it interfered with interstate commerce, there was a basis for federal prosecutors to build a racketeering case. This presentation was made to raise awareness of the issue, and I hope that however the word gets out there, somehow my story gets out there and the story of the countless other women and children suffering like me finally reaches the consciousness of people in this country. I simply don't believe that Americans want this to happen to American families. And I believe that it's happening because they don't believe it can. I'm just asking you to please believe me and please share this and please follow me and share my story on other platforms. One of the issues that's a focus of the movement to reform family courts is what's called Cadence Law, which is an initiative by the Department of Justice to have every state enact a law banning reunification camps. This is, of course, an important issue in states where it happens. But another reason I made this presentation is because I think it's important for people to understand that legislation is not effective when there's no enforcement and when the institutions are corrupt. What is needed is enforcement. What is needed is for judges and attorneys to be made to follow their ethical guidelines and to uphold the law. There's an assumption that they will police their own, and they are not. And for example, the Illinois bar didn't revoke David Pasulka's bar license until he was indicted, even though that was 3 years after the mother who reported him for threatening to take her children away if she didn't have sex with him had made the report to the bar. By the way, he did take her children. He did have that power. We need enforcement from informally through institutions like the press, through political leaders, and through civil rights leaders, most notably the American Civil Liberties Union. We need them to hold these courts accountable and to make public the abuses that are happening as I speak. We also need enforcement from the Department of Justice, because a breakdown in an American court is a breakdown in American democracy. For the people for whom this presentation is intended, we understand that American democracy is at threat, and we can't really sleep on the job and give bad actors any reason to argue that our institutions do not work. And women like me need advocacy. The primary reason this abuse is happening is because people like you find it easier to assume that I'm lying, confused, or stupid. And that might help you sleep at night, but it doesn't save my children or the many other children who are being exploited and abused because of corrupt family courts. So please share this with 3 people who care about civil rights. Please spread this story.